Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Bach's Italian Style session. In the next 2 hours, you will be hearing 4 presentations on this topic. And on your conference booklet, I draw to your attention from page 40, where there's a program, and from page 41, you will find abstracts of individual speakers. So please have a look at abstract. Now, first speaker of this session is by Dr. Alberto Sanna. Dr. Sanna is a violinist, musicologist, educator, and manager who specializes in early music. He has worked in Oxford, Liverpool, and is currently Director of Early Music as Education, EMAE, a registered charity that promotes the value of early music as a tool for cultural, social, and economic development. Today, his paper is entitled Ut Musica, Musica, J.S. Bach's Imitatio of Corelli and Historiography of Musical Influence. The second paper, which you are going to hear continuously, is by Sara Bondi and Giovanni Damiano. The Bondi-Damiano duo was born within Project HAR, H-A-R, a Cuneo-based association that promotes teaching, performance, study, and research in the musical, photographic, and literary fields. Sara Bondi studied at the Conservatoire of Cuneo and Vienna, and perfected herself with such masters as Riccardo Gianni, Antonio Buetz, Bruno Cavallo, Mauro Scappini, and Diana Baroni, among many others. Winner of several competitions, she made her debut in 2012 at Carnegie Hall in New York. She has several orchestral collaborations, including the orchestra of the Teatro Federico of Cagliari and the Teatro Real of Madrid. She has a degree in languages. And Giovanni Damiano, he first studied at the Corelli Institute of Pinerolo and then went to the Conservatory of Cuneo, where he obtained first-level degree, followed by the second level. He has collaborated as an accompanist for the CRT Foundation and regularly carries out his activity with musicians, singers, and choristas. He has a degree in Cultural Heritage Sciences and currently teaches music education. Our third speaker, Tommaso Graiff. Tommaso Graiff graduated in piano performance with top grades at the Hochschule für Musik und Theater, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, Leipzig. Complementary to his instrumental studies, he is pursuing university studies in classical philology and musicology at the University of Leipzig. Since 2019, he has been awarded a scholarship by the Foundation Yehudi Menuhin Live Music Now. In 2018, he was assigned a scholarship of the Europäische Akademie für Musik und Darstellende Kunst. Since many years, he has been a member of Donatori di Musica, an organization promoting concert series on theological hospitals. Tommaso Graiff has appeared in concerts all over Europe as a soloist and chamber musician, and is a regular guest of named festivals and institutions. Together with fellow pianist Elena Postuni, he recently performed Bach's Concerto for 2 keyboards in the Great Hall at Hochschule für Musik Leipzig. And our fourth and final speaker, Stefan Michels. Stefan Michels studied Protestant theology and classical philology at the Philipps University in Marburg from 2009 to 2015. He completed his studies in October 2015 as Magister Theologiae. From 2015 to 2020, Michels researched on the Reformation history topic. In 2016, he was a scholarship holder of the Hessian Luther Foundation. From 2017 to 19, Michels worked as a research assistant in specialist church history at the University of Marburg. In doing so, he worked on the critical edition of the late medieval Opus Adum Valde, which will be published in Leiden in 2020. During this time, Michels began to focus his research interest on the connection between music and theology. He held an interdisciplinary seminar on Johann Sebastian Bach and the Psalms, and founded a research group for musical Bible interpretation, especially in the 18th century, which started work in spring 2020. In July 2020, Michels received his doctorate with a Reformation history work summa cum laude. Since January this year, he has been a research assistant at Johannes Gutenberg-Universität at Mainz at the chair of the Church History of Modern Times. At present, he is working on his habilitation project, Felt Truth, the music theology of J.S. Bach, and on further publications, for example, about the significance of Albert Schweitzer for the present theological research on Bach. Michels plays on the piano and the organ since he was a child. He was also a member of the Limburg Boys Choir from 1993 to 2013. So this is the time that we are going to hear for 2 hours, 4 papers in succession. And at the end, we will have a lively dialogue, hopefully getting a lot of interesting questions from the public. So the first lecture by Dr. Albert Sanna.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the Program Committee and the Organizing Committee of Bach Italia for inviting me to give this lecture recital. The live musical examples are kindly provided by the string ensemble The Wandering Fiddlers and made possible by the generosity of my wonderful colleagues Marino Capulli, violinist, Elizabeth Elliott, cellist, Vincent Rowley, videographer, and Eleonora Pintus, communication manager. I'm grateful, as ever, for their continued support. Ut musica, musica. J.S. Bach's Imitatio of Corelli and the Historiography of Musical Influence. Great composers, to be truly great, are reckoned to be able to sum up their predecessors' achievements, as well as open up new vistas for the benefit of their successors. Unlike ordinary people, it does not suffice for them to do their best under the best possible circumstances. It does not seem enough to meet their own immediate material and spiritual needs, but also those of a posterity, which in its struggle to make sense of the scanty, scattered, and often random data from the past, cherishes those universal cultural meta-narratives that since the end of the 18th century have come to replace the grand religious meta-narratives of the pre-modern era. Organicity, rise and fall, progress, development. These are the words one most commonly encounters. So, our musical heroes must be revolutionaries, steeped in tradition, the name of Beethoven springs to mind. When such a tenet is argued from the microphones of the BBC or classic FM radio stations, it is no more than at its best an appealing type of popular musicology, and at its worst, a misleading marketing strategy. When argued through the channels of prestigious academic publishers, however, the tenet amounts to an old-fashioned explanatory model which, though less current than it once was, is still used in common musical parlance and adopted by performing artists and their students or followers, the so-called historiography of musical influence. The music of Arcangelo Corelli and Johann Sebastian Bach is often seen under the lenses of musical influence and explained in the light of what I have described in an article published by the journal Early Music Performer as the Baroque paradigm. First, it must fit into the three-tiered Baroque narrative that poses an early, a middle, and a late phase. Second, it must fulfill the late Baroque mission of perfecting a variety of instrumental and vocal genres, sonata, suite, concerto, recitative, aria, cantata, as well as the principles of harmonic tonality. Third, it must act as an incubator to improve on the work of the older contemporaries and show the way forward to the younger contemporaries. Corelli does it by merging North Italian from Bologna and South Italian from Rome traditions of musical composition. Bach, perceived as the greater composer and therefore entrusted with a bigger task, does it by merging North and South German tradition of musical composition, as well as French and Italian ones. The evidence is taken from the music itself. When Bach writes an aria variata alla maniera italiana, such as the theme and variations in A major, BWV 989 from the Andreas Bach pool, is said to betray Italian influences. When Corelli writes a strict fugue, is said to be influenced by the academic temper of Bologna, the site of the oldest university in Europe. Yet, this is like saying that if you eat in a French restaurant, you are influenced by French cuisine, when in fact, it may be more accurate to say that occasionally you like tasting French food. Or like saying that if I cook Bolognese spaghetti, I'm being influenced by my Italian mother, whereas I may be simply repeating something my mother taught me to do to survive when I left home for university. And if you think this is just a question of language, well, words do matter when attempting to communicate, and especially so when we're aiming to communicate the findings of serious research. Unlike music theorists, music historians are more interested in differences than in similarities, and it is from Corelli's and Bach's distinctive and distinguished voices that I should like this lecture recital to proceed. From the first movement of Corelli Trio Sonatas, Opus 4 number 3 in A major, Largo, and from Bach's three-part Sinfonia in C minor, BWV 788. Even within one and the same polyphonic texture and string sonority, the differences are so noticeable that my mother, again, who wanted to become an opera singer despite being tone deaf, fortunately she ended up teaching Italian history in a secondary school, will be able to tell one composer from the other. And the use of similar harmonic progressions is not a sufficient reason not to give each composer his own credit. Admittedly, one could contend that I chose my examples only to prove my point, disregarding questions of genre and style and turning a well-known keyboard piece into a string trio to demonstrate that though assimilated to the same medium, the two great men still speak a different musical language. And this may be so. However, the purpose of my lecture recital is not to object to platitudes, but rather to argue that the concept of musical influence reduces Corelli's peculiar instrumental version of musical sensualism to a set of unassuming compositional procedures, which can be easily replicated as much as it turns Bach's profound musical knowledge into mere acts of intellectual pride. On the other hand, a less anachronistic category may well help us understand why Bach challenged himself with particular models and what the outcome was when he took Corelli's works as one such model. I am referring to the ancient rhetorical practice of imitatio, which humanists had revived since the 15th century and turned into the most conspicuous activity through which a relationship between a pre-existing text and a newly forged one was established. The Latin name encompassed a variety of cultural behaviors, ranging from transcription to adaptation, arrangement, elaboration, revision, reworking, recomposition, parody, and prompted by a plurality of aesthetic desiderata, including imitation, allusion, emulation, homage, following, competition, and rivalry. The mother of all imitations, so to speak, was the imitatio Christi, the attempt to live and act as Christ himself had lived and acted. In the musical field, imitatio met a number of educational and artistic needs. Instances of imitatio are well documented for all eras and places, and by no means limited to the more thoroughly studied 16th century practices. We shall begin with the most obvious example, the tema con suggetto Signore Corelli elaborato, alias the organ fugue on a theme by Corelli in B minor, BWV 579, which has already been the object of musicologists' attention for the simple reason that it leaves no doubts about its model. Here is Bach's starting point for imitatio, the second movement of Corelli's trio sonata in B minor, opus 3, number 4, Vivace. What Bach does with it is to apply a characteristic pedagogic technique that takes as its point of departure the mechanic processes of transcription and arrangement, as exemplified in the opening bars. and he gradually evolves into what humanists would have called glossing on authority, a series of annotation, at times marginal, at times substantial, through which the meaning of the original text is made more explicit, as in the following passage. To put it bluntly, BWV 579 is Bach's way of reading the Corelli text. Any talented and diligent student would have been expected to be able to do something similar, however. Thus, the next example is meant to take us to an entirely different level. It is the Prelude in B minor from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, BWV 869, number 24. Which Peter Williams has described as, quote, a Corellian binary trio sonata with walking bass, unquote. Although slightly stereotypical and somewhat inaccurate, Corelli's walking bass movements are rarely binary and never so uniform, Williams' description may nevertheless be useful for the sake of argument. As a possible model in the same key of B minor, I have chosen the first movement of Corelli's Trio Sonata, Opus 2, number 8, Adagio. Bach's Imitatio is an instance of an artistic rather than a pedagogic technique, and a very successful specimen of that. It treads a thin line between parody and homage, and though we will never know for sure Bach's original intention, the result is especially compelling, as you can hear for yourself. One can appreciate how, after first part quite consistently Corellian, Bach goes out of his way to express his identity as a self-conscious master and pours into the Corellian mold several gestures of his own making, which smell of Bach all along. The fact is that, unlike all the German musicians of the time, Bach never left his homeland to embark on the so-called Grand Tour as part of a nobleman's retinue. He had to be content with whatever compositional, manuscript, or printed models he came across, and with whatever performative models he came in contact with, however filtered may they have been by somebody else's personality and likings. And yet, his Imitatio Corelli is significant, at least in two respects. First, it covers the whole range of approaches, from the transformative, as in the fugue BWV 579, to the dissimulative, as in the prelude BWV 869. Second, it affords a new perspective on an old world, at once alien and familiar, as in a sort of musical recollection of Bach's mental grand tour. In the end, the humanist rhetorical question is not whether to imitate, this would have been taken for granted as a standard pedagogic and artistic practice, but rather whom to imitate. For as one of the leading scholars of Italian humanists, Eugenio Garin, noted a long time ago, to imitate is to find oneself through someone else's model, but only to affirm oneself in an individuality which stands out as truer precisely by means of that relationship and confrontation. Per litteras provocati, pariut in se ipsis. Provoked by the way of letters, they produce knowledge within themselves. Thank you.
For one of those lucky chances that often bring to the most fruitful encounters, in March we fell upon two very similar statements about the Sonata BWV 1035 in E major for flute and continuo by Johann Sebastian Bach. It struck us that both Robert Marshall and Barthold Kuiken considered that work the most modernly written among Bach's flute sonatas. Assuming that modern at that time meant Italian or Italianizing, we have tried to understand how and how much BWV 1035 takes its distances from the other flute sonatas by Bach, and how much it could have drawn from the Italian language of the time. First of all, then, we compared BWV 1035 with the other authentic sonatas by J.S. Bach. Then, we tried to identify which contemporary Italian works could help us find an answer to the second question. The choice has fallen upon Vivaldi's sonatas for transverse flute for several reasons. First of all, even though the two composers never met in person, it is well known that Bach met at least Vivaldi's music, thanks to the manuscripts that were shown him by Pisendel, first violin in the Dresden Orchestra, who had studied in Italy with the Venetian maestro. Bach acquired a profound knowledge of their style and language by transcribing some of them for keyboard instruments. Moreover, it has often been assumed that exactly the contact with the Dresden Orchestra, and in particular with the flutist Buffardin, could have taught Bach the possibilities of the transverse flute, more than the collaboration with Breiter and Würdig in Köthen. In 1717, in addition, the oboist Blochwitz started to work also as a flutist in the same orchestra. This was precisely the year in which the virtual meeting between Bach and Vivaldi took place. Among the manuscripts, there were also some concerti da camera with transverse flute, and it is justified to think, along with Sardelli, that Blochwitz and Dufardin were the addressee on trust of these works. We don't know whether Bach and Blochwitz ever met, but we consider it important not to lose the focus on this multiple intersection between Vivaldi, the Dresdner Orchestra, and Bach. Despite all this, the still open question of the authenticity of these works gave us something to think about. We finally overcame the impasse, deciding that they could in any case be meaningful for our question, provided we took some criteria into account. For one thing, we wanted to compare works of the same type, namely sonatas with sonatas and not with concerts, and written for the same instrument, in our case the transverse flute and not the recorder. Furthermore, accepting Sardelli's arguments, those sonatas represent anyway great examples of the reception of the Italian text in Nordic area during Bach's time. Moreover, those sonatas often include fragments of other compositions by Vivaldi, above all works for violin, and they are consequently not devoid of his style. If it is true, finally, that the composer of RV 50 was exactly the flutist Blochwitz of the Dresdner Orchestra, this work would not be so far away from J.S. Bach, Action Song. Let's then see in practice what the results of said comparisons are, bringing evidence of how the BWV 1035 can be said to be more modern and nearer to the Italian taste than the other of J.S. Bach flute sonatas.
First of all, the analysis of the scores shows how the principal differences are to be found more in the formal aspect and in the writing for the flute than in the harmonic field. Formally, in fact, it is extremely evident that E major is practically devoid of the counterpointistic elements that are instead contained in the other sonatas, like in the three-voice fugue of the BWV 1030. In the same sonata, the first movement presents a particularly thick writing, rich in chromatisms, in which the continuous switching of the principal motive from one instrument to the other is particularly striking. It becomes evident that, even though melody and harmony are always strictly connected in Bach, while in H minor the two instruments share the principal motives, in E major the melody is always played by the flute, who takes on a solistic role, exactly as it happens in the Italian sonatas. Here, the difference is still more evident, thanks to the barren harmonic accompaniment. is again extremely evident in BWV 1032. Take, for example, the importance given to the cembalo in the incipit of the first movement. Notwithstanding the extremely melodic writing of the E minor sonata, in which the flute seems to be treated exactly as in A major, the two works present some important differences. The BWV 1034, for instance, contains numerous imitative sections. Moreover, comparing the first movement of the two sonatas highlights a clear difference of character. Musicologists have in fact defined BWV 1034 as sonata da chiesa and 1035 as sonata da camera. Here is an excerpt from 1034. In comparison with all these examples, the writing of BWV 1035 seems much lighter, with its improvisatory adagio manno tanto and the three dance movements. The same lightness is the defining feature of the Italian sonatas observed. Listen to these examples. It is also interesting to notice the presence of movements called siciliana, or built on its typical rhythmic pattern in almost every Italian sonata, as it happens in BWV 1035. Bach, however, surprises us this time, introducing a sort of canon between the flute and the left hand at the beginning of his siciliana. Notwithstanding this exception, the modernity of its writing doesn't seem lessened. The extreme lyricism of the theme seems in fact almost amplified by said imitation that stops very soon at bar 5. The same kind of lyricism can be found in the Italian sonatas. Listen, for example, to these. Castellani observes that from its first appearance, the Italian Sonata for transverse flute and continuo shows well-defined instrumental characteristics, often derived intact from idioms of violin and vocal technique. Is this lyricist then the more distinctively Italian figure of these sonatas? Let's listen to one more example.
RV48 has long been considered the only sonata for transverse flute composed without any doubt by Vivaldi. Funny enough, it is also formally the one which BWV 1035 resembles the most. The sequence of movements starts in fact with an introductory andante affettuoso in free lyric style. It goes on with an allegro and binary time that, however, starts on the beat and not on the upbeat, like Bach's allegro. It follows a larghetto with Siciliana's meter and rhythm, and the sonata is closed by a fast 4 movement, allegro brillante, in ternary time. Another typical Italian or Vivaldi style feature is often contained in these sonatas, the terrace dynamics or echoes, like in this example. And look what we find at the beginning of the second movement of BWV 1035. It's exactly an echo suggestion, whereas the varied writing of the starting motive would make one feel like emphasizing the repetition and not dampening it. If this second movement has been sometimes compared to the rigodon of the Four Concerto Royale by Couperin, it seems anyway that the Italian elements can prevail over the French ones. The art of embellishing the melody is in fact here something more than a way to create effects or alter the melodic line. It becomes its spine, underlining its vocal nature, a cantabile played by melodic instruments. Besides the 4 transverse flute sonatas, there is another work, RV84, now rightly included among the so-called concerti da camera, that Riom has instead catalogued among the sonatas by Vivaldi. This wrong attribution brought us to take it briefly into consideration as an authentic example of Vivaldi's sonata language for transverse flute. It is also important to say that it is conserved at the Sächsische Landesbibliothek in Dresden, that musical geographical intersection point that was so meaningful for the virtual communication between Vivaldi and Bach. Its style confirms what we have observed previously completely. Lightness and lyricism are also here the main features of the Italian language, this time combined with a greater virtuosity for the solo instrument. This is probably due to the fact that, as we said, the work was to be played by the professional flutists Dufardin and Blochwitz, and not simply by amateurs that wanted to get new works by Vivaldi, as it was probably the case for the sonatas attributed to Vivaldi. We can thus conclude that modernity for BWV 1035 in E major is to be found first of all in the practically complete absence of polyphonic and imitative style, and in a way of writing for the flute that it is more similar to the vocal style, with shorter sentences and that pays more attention to what is doable or not on the flute. Both Marshall and Kuyken, the authors that stimulated our research, agree with us. It's probably not a case that the writing of the sonata in E major can be placed during the time when Frederick II of Prussia started to be especially interested in Italy. In those same years, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach started to work as a court harpsichordist there, and it is easy to imagine that the elder Bach wanted to create a personal contact with the king by offering a composition to his secretary, Frederiksdorf, who was also a flutist, using a lighter and more fashionable style. Let us now listen to the entire sonata, but not before having pointed out, as Goglio and Setti do, that for Bach, composing never means putting together elements that are foreign to his spirit, just using the experience and skills that he certainly possessed. It's much more taking all those elements and creating something new, and at the same time, perfectly recognizable as Bach.
Good afternoon. My name is Tommaso Graiff, and in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about what is one of the most important, and we could even say one of the quintessential artistic operations in all of Johann Sebastian Bach's life, and that is the keyboard transcription of some instrumental concertos by Vivaldi, Corelli, and Alessandro and Benedetto Marcello. I'm going to speculate about the purposes and the possible destinations of these transcriptions, as well as focus on some structural features of the transcriptions. Eventually, we will also have a closer look to the considerable influence these transcriptions had on Bach's later works and on his later keyboard writing. And hereby, my focus will be on the transcription of Benedetto Marcello's D minor oboe concerto, Bachwerkeverzeichnis 974. I will also do some comparison between the transcription and the original set of parts, which was probably quite similar to the one Bach had at his disposal. Now, all the transcription date without any exception from Bach's second stay in Weimar, and most likely they were written between 1713 and 1715. In 1713, the Prince Johann Ernst von Sachsen-Weimar came back from his stay in Utrecht in the Netherlands with a lot of new orchestral material. It was some edition and some manuscripts, mostly of Italian and French music. He quite likely also found a copy of the very first edition of Vivaldi's Estro Armonico, which had been published as Opus 3 by Rogers in 1711. 1715 is the year of the prince's death. He died aged only 19 because of quite a long illness. So the adaptation of works for a new destination is by no means an uncommon practice at this time. What is quite peculiar is the transcription of a concerto, so a work intended for a soloist and an ensemble, for a solo instrument, for a keyboard instrument. Quite unusual is also the sheer amount of transcriptions Bach wrote down in these years. We have 5 organ transcriptions and no less than 17 transcriptions for the harpsichord. It is also worth noting that Bach did not only transcribe authentic Italian concertos, he also wrote transcriptions for concertos written in the Italian style by German composers, such as Telemann or the prince himself, who was a passionate musician and had been educated by no less than Bach. Musicologists have been struggling for many, many years trying to find the original purpose of these transcriptions. The first position has been that of Bach's first official biographer, Johann Nikolaus Forkel, who sees the transcriptions as a means to acquire the abilities which were common among Italian composers. And those are Ordnung, Zusammenhang und Verhältnis. So we could say order, continuity, and proportion. However, Bach had already written several movements in the concerto or ritornello form by that time, notably in the cantata 196, which dates back to a couple of years prior to the Italian transcriptions. So there have been other assumptions, for instance, that of sharing, according to whom Bach transcribed the concerts in order to provide the amateur with playable sources for music genre which was indeed quite en vogue at that time. This last assumption could be questioned by the fact that the transcriptions were not published, nor did they find a real circulation in manuscript form during Bach's lifetime. On the other hand, it's still more satisfactory than the idea of Bach becoming acquainted with a new style by transcribing works by other composers. Some more recent hypotheses about the destination of the transcriptions are that of a friendly competition between Bach and his cousin Johann Walter, who indeed transcribed some other concertos for keyboard. But that's also quite difficult to accept, because we could think of, and we know from Forkel about competitions in sight reading. We could really think about competitions in improvising. We could even make an hypothesis of a competition in composing, but it seems to me unrealistic that Bach wanted to compete with other musicians in transcribing other composers' works. Since Bach also transcribed some of Johann Ernst's concertos, it has been raised the hypothesis of a memorial tribute for the prince. And that might as well be true for those concertos, but does not definitely apply to the transcriptions after Vivaldi, Corelli, and Marcello. In any case, let's leave all those questions open for the moment, and let's have a comparative look to the transcription after the D minor Marcello concerto and the oldest surviving set of parts, which was published by Rogers in Amsterdam in 1717. So still a couple of years after Johann Ernst presumably acquired the music, but not as much as to make relevant changes to the music which could possibly affect our analysis. The opening gesture of the orchestral ritornello in Marcello's concerto is scored in the Amsterdam edition with an unisono of violins and violas. Bach doubles the line with the lower octave, probably to obtain a more orchestral sonority. A couple of bars later, the same figure is presented in an embellished version. Bach varies then the 16th note patterns when the ritornello comes back in the key of F major. Already at the very first D minor cadence in the solo oboe, Bach gives us a wonderful sample of the two ways of decorating a melodic line. That is the willkürliche and the unwillkürliche. Bach varies then the 16th note patterns when the ritornello comes back in the key of F major. Already at the very first D minor cadence in the solo oboe, Bach gives us a wonderful sample of the two ways of decorating a melodic line. That is the willkürliche and the unwillkürliche Manieren. We had already experienced the willkürliche Manieren in the ritornello, that is actually the reduction of the original note values by adding some written out embellishments, whereas the unwillkürliche Manieren consist of all other embellishments, like here, for instance, the Pral Trilla. All this decoration sounds indeed quite idiomatic on a harpsichord, in contrast to the following passages, which report actually just the virtuosic formulas in Marcello's oboe writing. Quite interestingly, and in a very pragmatic way, the widespread strings writing is compressed by Bach in some places in order to obtain a better playability and also to guarantee the solistic quality of the upper voice. Throughout the whole first movement, the variety of embellishments is quite dazzling, and it gives quite a decisive virtuoso character to the piece, as we can hear from this almost premonition of the D minor harpsichord concerto. Or later on, through fill-in lines and chords, Bach gives a very orchestral effect to some passages. Interestingly, here Bach is also correcting the voice leading of the original source, which was by adding a seventh chord, which makes a significant improvement. As a good and imaginative continuo player would do, Bach also connects with passages and figurations, harmonies, which would otherwise be isolated and would not make a musical flow possible. Worth noting is also the omission of 6 bars of music towards the end of the first movement, at bar 44 of the Bach transcription. At this point, the strings repeat the 6-bar phrase of the oboe, and since in a harpsichord transcription there is no real possibility to imitate the difference in color in a same melodic content, which is alternatively played by the oboe and then by the strings, and since these 6 bars do not necessarily contribute to the musical structure, Bach found them to be superfluous and omitted them, making this the only structural difference between the original concerto and his transcription. The second movement, the Adagio of the concerto, has become quite a well-known piece over the years, and with good reason, I would say, since it's truly a moment of touching and poignant beauty. Now, it starts with an almost ostinato figure in the strings, and Bach confines it to the lower octave, as he had already done in the first movement. We do not know for certain for which instruments these transcriptions are intended, but these kind of adaptations hints for the possibility of an execution also on a one keyboard harpsichord. This is the beginning of the oboe solo according to the Amsterdam edition. Now, it's clearly incomplete. It's just a hint, a skeleton on which a skilled soloist would improvise. Interestingly, it's loosely based on a typical harmonic pattern, a typical harmonic progression of Italianate concertos, which is the so-called quintfall sequence, as German musicologists call it. So what is Bach to do with a melodic line which is just stating a harmonic content and is almost wishing to be decorated? Well, he decorates it. And he decorates it starting by just adding a small appoggiatura then repeating the same appoggiatura, but this time all the way up through the figure. Subsequently, he is diminishing the note values one more time. And the last time we can enjoy a very vocal decoration, almost with a coloratura character. And all these different ways of decorating are being depicted just in the initial sequence of the movement. Later on, he introduces further features of Baroque ornamentations, like, for instance, the practice of retarding the melodic flow by inserting syncopations. This device will be found in almost all of Bach's later concerto movements, notably also in his only later concerto for solo keyboard, the Concerto nach Italienischem Gusto, in the second part of the Klavierübung. Let's listen to a passage from this slow movement, and I don't think there will be need of any comment about the resemblance between these two works. We will analyze further influences of these transcriptions on Bach's later works in a few minutes. But let's first summarize some of the principles which may have guided Bach while writing these transcriptions and which we have come across so far. First of all, Bach is willing to write a playable transcription. That is, he is writing both ensemble and solo parts on a single playable score. Because of that, he has to arrange the ensemble lines in a very pragmatic way in order to make them playable all the time at the same time as the player is mastering the solo part. The solo oboes part is maintained unaltered most of the time in the first movement, probably as to preserve the original character and the original figurations of Marcello's composition. Bach adds ornamentation almost only at the nevralgic spots of the movement, that is, the most important cadences, and the repetition of the ritornelli in different keys. The ornamentation is much more extensive in the second movement, and here Bach seems to be willing to give us a compendium of all the possible ways of decorating a melody. So, all in all, in this package, we don't only get a wonderful transcription of a very nice concerto, we also become acquainted with the performance practice of the time, since Bach is writing out all of the decoration without any kind of shorthand. And also in the first movement, he is guiding us through the structure so we can grasp the form of the piece just by playing the transcription and noticing important spots like cadenzas or ritornelli, which are also emphasized thanks to their decoration. The study of the Italian concertos left many traces in Bach's work. We don't have the time now to analyze structural and formal implications, which, by the way, are quite well known. Everyone knows that we cannot even think of works like the Brandenburg concertos, the concertos for a solo instrument and orchestra, many cantata movements which are modeled on a ritornello form without the study of Italian models. However, one last topic for tonight's talk, and I really hope that won't be too much ground to cover, will be the influence transcribing the concertos had on Bach's own keyboard writing, especially in works which were written right after completing the Italian transcriptions, such as the very last of the toccatas to be composed. This is the G major one, and of course the English suites. Now, Bach's toccatas have really little in common with Italian music of the beginning of the 18th century. They rather come from an older tradition, the tradition of Northern German music in the late 17th century, with this very typical alternation of slower and faster parts, of more severe contrapuntal and more virtuoso parts. However, he manages in this very last toccata to merge features of the Italian concerto with this older northern form. And on a whole, the toccata is modeled after a typical Italian concerto. It could be the form of a Corelli concerto. And also, and that's quite striking, we have a passage at the very beginning, after a virtuoso opening, with a bunch of chords going down the keyboard, which is really has quite an interesting resemblance with a passage, for instance, in the first movement of the transcription of Marcello's D minor oboe concerto. Let's have a look at the two passages one after the other. Kind of chordal writing would be quite atypical and is indeed not to be found in any harpsichord work by Bach preceding the transcription of Italian concertos. In the third English suite in G minor, which could as well be called an Italian suite, for it is preceded by an opening movement which is by any means a ritornello movement of a concerto. Now in this suite, at the very beginning, we can hear the different instrument groups, the different members of an ensemble coming in one after the other in an imitation, which leads to actually to a written out crescendo, which is a very orchestral sounding device, and we could also barely think of a passage like this without the experience of transcribing orchestral concertos. Later on, the whole movement is built on a series of these quintal sequences, which are really idiomatic for Italian concerto writing. At the end of this talk, we can now come back to our original question regarding the possible destination of the transcriptions. Of course, it is quite difficult to draw a line in Bach's time between a study destination, a performance destination, or even a private performance destination. However, it is to me of some significance the fact that some innovations in keyboard writing, which are to be found for the very first time in these transcriptions, then become actually part of Bach's own everyday keyboard idiom. And so even if the initial aim, the original aim, might as well have been that of studying the scores by the Italian 8 masters, the final product is not only a perfectly playable transcription, it's a work of striking virtuosity, which can give us insight into Bach's well-known instrumental capabilities. Furthermore, it's a cultural operation, and the acquaintance with the Italian concerto tradition would have long-lasting influence in all of Bach's compositions for the decades to come. Thank you.
Honorable ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear listeners online. It is a great honor for me to be allowed to speak to you as part of this magnificent conference. In addition to the numerous high-class musicological expertises these days, I hope that as a theologian, I succeed in being able to enrich the wealth of perspectives on our discussions about the work of Johann Sebastian Bach. Today, I would like to offer you a brief insight into my current research, a brief look into my workshop, if you like. In the moment, I'm working on a monography on the musical theology of the Leipzig Thomas Cantor. Herein, I know myself connected with an intensive theological research of Bach, which has been able to mature ever further since the 1950s. Yet we theologians learned during the last decades that one knows the spiritual as well as the intellectual depth of the work of Bach only in an interdisciplinary view appropriately. The recently posthum completed Bach Kommentar by Leipzig dogmatist Martin Petzold is an idea of these knowledge fruits. In addition, we can observe diverse individual studies of partly also musicologically qualified theological colleagues like Jochen Arnold, or musicologists with a theologic knowledge interest like Michael Marison. My self-deployed task is to bundle among methodologically contemporary standards perspectives of previous research and to transfer it into a fundamental hermeneutic study on the theological interpretation of Bach's work. Within my subject, church history, musical sources are in part still blind, or better, deaf spots of our source knowledge. In doing so, music is one of the most important and at the same time the most underestimated source language of Protestant culture in modern times. My first point, the theological interest in music. Since the writings of the well-known Berlin theologian of the 19th century, Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher, on aesthetics, music for the theological consciousness is far more than mere cultivated sound noise, more than something that makes the divine service appear somehow more beautiful or dignified, and more than an accompanying chord to diverse theological and dogmatic high-altitude flights. In Schleiermacher's thinking, music became a theological communication system because it brings the intuition and feeling of the universe in a completely different way to validity than the pure language it could. This also has to do with his notion of religion in general, which as such is not a theological form of thought, but precisely intuition or feeling of the universe. The time around 1800 may well be considered a high time of aesthetics in German language philosophy, and Schleiermacher is then, contrary to the view of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, one of the most significant philosophical thinkers of his time. His motivation, though, is a theological one. How can the artificially beautiful become theologically true and convincing? How to understand music, but also other arts, theologically? And what does all this have to do with religion? These questions form the beginning of a theological music research that finds its continuation to this day. But while philosophical research can already demonstrate numerous monographic studies on music philosophy, theology here continues to lack basic research, even with regard to a theological music aesthetics, as it has been waiting for its ex-formulation since Schleiermacher. In recent times, however, theology is devoted to music, after a long time above all the visual arts were at the forefront of theological art hermeneutics. The work of Johann Sebastian Bach is thereby, in addition to the great romantics or contemporary music, and ever new fields of research in the focus of the interest. In doing so, for a long time, rather small part particular studies were presented, which appeared in their construction more exegetic philological than theologic aesthetical. Yet we theologians must confess, we lack the necessary methodological knowledge to be able to try such studies. Here we should and must resort to relevant musicological studies in order not to underestimate the intellectual depth of a musical work. But religious and spiritual music now belongs once in the praise spectrum of a theologian. So what do we do with this finding and aporia? That which theologians actually always do. We just write off and see afterwards if it works. Therefore, please do not expect profound work internal studies on the musical historical kinship of Pergolesi and Bach today. But please allow me, though, to put forward a proposal on theological practicability of understanding Bach's way of working, which I will be happy to discuss with you in depth afterwards. For my research, I'm dependent to your advice and critical objections and would be very pleased to deepen interdisciplinary cooperation to think about Bach. My second point, Bach and the amygdala. The newer musicology tend to a more holistic interpretation of musical works by discussing and analyzing both the setting and the intention of a composition. For the first part of this double-part task, it is necessary that the exact musical structure of a work is recorded before being associated with the historical contextualization of a composition. Time, circumstances characterize music, and music shapes time circumstances. To no one lower than the great Jubilar 2020 Ludwig van Beethoven, this can be read out, as the musicologist Martin Gegg emphasizes. It is an important part of the setting analysis of a work to fathom and understand its emotional structure. What emotional impression leaves the structure of the work? How is his soundness emotionally colored? The pace, the instrumentation. Could we make conclusions about these insights about the composer's intentions? For composition techniques of the Baroque period, it applies above all to understanding the application and imaging of effects in the music. That also applies, and especially, to the sacred works of Johann Sebastian Bach. The background forms the effect teaching by the French philosopher René Descartes. His tractate about the passions of the soul shaped many musicological writings of the time of Bach. The best example of this is Johann Matheson's Vollkommener Kapellmeister from 1739. Bach and other composers, like for example Georg Philipp Telemann, knew the writings of Matheson well. Matheson imparted to them on a secondary path Descartes' effect teaching on the form of a composition teaching, so that many Baroque composers made themselves heard about, making Cartesianism being heard. Matheson gives indications as to how text templates, libretti, are appropriately to be set to music so that the listeners can be part of the story and the composition only by listening. This is very interesting for the musical setting of biblical librettos, such as Bach's libretti. For his late cantata, Tilge höchster meine Sünden, Psalm 51 faced him. Pergolesi chose for his musical Mourning the time-honored medieval hymn Stabat Mater Dolorosa. We will talk about both holy libretti a little later. Both musicians had to bring the emotional coloration of their texts into music, with contemporary composition technique helping them. Baroque composition technique regularly proves to be a mixture of creative creation and technical skill, the musical craft or trade, if you like. The composing of emotional settings is part of both aspects of Baroque composition. Whether componists of sacred works it wanted or not, the Baroque opera was technically a godfather to them all here. The opera is the uncrowned queen of emotions, a melting pot of feeling and an explosion of the interior to the outside. Opera composers deliver whole emotional tone paintings and draw the audience into a story that makes everyone become a vigorous lover or a lovely princess for one evening. Bach knew the force of the opera and the power of the images it imparted. He wanted to avail himself of these aspects for his cantata compositions and his musical settings of biblical librettos. The Bible, so Bach seemed thinking, addresses people in the same emotional levels as the freely invented stories of the opera and the rest of the art music. For Bach, however, music was more than entertainment. Music was a tool of God and an image of his voice, so that his redeeming word can not only grow under, but also in the people. Bach's emotional paintings draw people into the succession of Jesus among the gospel of God. Bach does not want us to learn and understand the biblical stories in their contexts, but rather feel what we should feel to be close to God, so that his word gets real relevance in people's lives, so that this word can be lead to the self-reflection of the individual between self and world, so that it finally becomes individual theology facing the own sins and failures. Bach was deeply moved by texts like Psalm 51, which leads to the need for forgiveness of one's own sinfulness in order to point to salvation in Christ. Quite the twin sound of Lutheran theology between law and gospel. How now do you get into the process sought by the composer as a listener of a cantata of Bach? In my opinion, about the level of feeling. By applying to Bach what Mattheson and others teach about the mediation of emotional settings, the biblical image becomes emotionally impregnated, and the believer experiences in the religious field the encounter with the biblical testified Christ. In the compositions of Bach can be determined corresponding traces. For example, for the cantata Tilge höchster meine Sünden is to ask why Bach makes an almost complete parody of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater. Of course, the music of the Italian who died only recently was deeply touching and possessed a silent beauty that rarely existed. But Bach seemed to be more interested in Pergolesi's work than his artisanal finesse. The Leipzig cantor thought about Psalm 51 and tried to express musically the fear and distress of the sinner before God. This deep distress felt by the speaker of Psalm 51 seemed to correspond for Bach with the pain of the Mother of God under the cross of her Son. The effects of this content-related link, which drew Bach, I would like to discuss a little deeper in the following. So my third point, the Pergolesi-Bach connection and the Italian way of feeling. Before you could think, I would like to serve with regard to Italy and feeling Nordic cliches, let us take a deeper look into Pergolesi's work. Pergolesi's Stabat Mater belongs to the late work of the Italian composer, although late work sounds a little ironic given the early death of Pergolesi. As the musicologist Francesco de Grada suspected, the Stabat Mater could be about a commissioned work that goes back to an initiative by Duke Marzio Domenico Carafa. The severely tuberculose-diseased Pergolesi was supplied in the Franciscan monastery Pozzuoli near Naples, for which the Carafa Duke was responsible. In his last month of life, Pergolesi composed both his Stabat Mater and a musical setting of the Marian hymn Salve Regina, perhaps a proof of his profound Marian piety. Pergolesi had already come to Naples 13 years before his early death in 1736 to complete his musical education. He had previously already earned himself as a young violin virtuoso at the Conservatorio dei Poveri di Gesù Cristo. This conservatory was about the only church-operated musical teaching institute far and wide. After Pergolesi had also brought to his attention as a composer with first operas, he was called before October 1732 to the Maestro di Capella at the court of Prince Ferdinando Colonna, Siciliano. Already at that time, the young Italian devoted himself to the composition of sacred works. In addition to a composed Vesper, originated, among other things, a first composed Missa by Pergolesi. Also a first, although somewhat enigmatic, motet for the honor of the Mother of God arose around 1732 in Naples under the title In Hac Diem Dictam Decora. It would surely be a worthwhile desideratum to follow the theological background of Pergolesi precisely with regard to its relation to Marian piety in Catholicism of its time. After Pergolesi had been appointed deputy chapel master of the city of Naples in 1734, he was able to settle musically permanently. Yet the director of music was only able to enjoy the merits of a steady employment just barely 2 years before he died in 1736. Nevertheless, the old legend, Pergolesi be impoverished at the end of his life and solitarily deceased, is lacking any truth and is just no more than a legend. Still in the year of his death, Pergolesi composed with his Stabat Mater one of his, until today, most well-known sacred works. Liturgy's history research in connection with his second great Marian hymn composed by Pergolesi at his end of life revealed that the first performance of the Stabat Mater was planned for March 1736. The philological problem with the works of Pergolesi is that his compositions were not published at lifetime, and that there are hardly any autographs of his work. This led to a large number of misattributions and forgeries during the 18th and 19th centuries, what research on Pergolesi still has to suffer today. The Stabat Mater but is a rare stroke of luck, because the autograph of this work still exists today and can be viewed in the Abbey of Monte Cassino near Rome. The composing circumstances of the Stabat Mater were dramatic, as Pergolesi hastened to finish the work because he did not know how much longer he had to live, as his first biographer, the Marchese di Villarosa, describes. The signs of near death can also be traced to the uncertainly acting handwriting and the many corrections in the autograph of the Stabat Mater. But much more, it is the emotional setting towards the end of the work that shows Pergolesi's serious thoughts and reflections of his own death and his obvious concerns for his salvation of his soul. The theological baseline of the medieval Stabat Mater is a soteriological one. The text is an intercession request of the praying sinner to the Mother of Christ, whose death on the cross is to overcome the death of all creatures. Thus, one's own dying is determined as salvation in the face of the cross of Christ. The text of the hymn takes the person at prayer pictorially with it under the cross of Christ. In addition to the passing scene, Jesus' mother dissolved by tears and sunk in deep sorrow. The tears of the Mother of God become the tears of the person at prayer, for who is able to remain emotionally untouched at the sight of the crying Mary. Quis est homo, qui non flerit matrem Christi si viderit, in tanto supplitio. Is there one who would not weep, whelmed in misery so deep, Christ's dear mother to behold? Pergolesi underlines the importance of this question by giving at the end of the corresponding movements a double quiz before a dramatically acting fermate sets. Visibly more moving in an allegro, Pergolesi leads the connection to the atonement death of Christ. In the heartbreaking but curative necessary dying of the Son of God lies for Pergolesi apparently a strong focus. Both the hymnus Stabat Mater and Pergolesi's musical implementation of the text aim at inner movement of the listeners and readers. They aim at inner participation of the faithful in the figuratively cross happening. The believers and faithful shall not hear, read, and see on their own. They shall feel the meaning of Jesus' death for one's life and let them come into meditative thinking about the cross of Christ. In inner and silent contemplation, the suffering of Christ becomes real in one's own life. And only then does death no longer have any threatening and dangerous significance, as already the Apostle Paul knew. The Mother under cross, the heartbreaking mourning and suffering woman Mary, represents the communion of believers who gather around Christ in his church. That's a strong picture that's deeply embossed when you're imagining it. Or even as you can see it as a sculptured Pietà in many churches. So you can see, hear, and feel the theological meaning and soteriological significance of that famous scene. The theological realization, the spiritual understanding, takes place in the interplay of the sensefulness of the death of Jesus, bundled in the sentient understanding and in the understanding feeling. Facing his own death, Pergolesi addresses the redeeming conditionality of the death of Jesus and also allows an emotionalization of death in general by placing the limits of all creational being, weeping mother of Jesus, at the center of this work. Their deep sorrow is spiritually inspiring and causes a momentous church musician north of the Alps to a deeper consideration of Pergolesi's composition. Why Bach fell in love with the Italian way of feeling. Bach's cantata Tilge höchster meine Sünden is remarkable in many ways. First of all, this cantata is one of his most late cantata compositions. It is dated on the last decade in Bach's life, between 1745 and 1748. Perhaps it was first performed in 1746 or 47, what is not quite sure. And even more important than the question of the dating is the semantic demand. Why does Bach parodiate the entire Stabat Mater of Pergolesi? Maybe a quick look at Bach's biblical libretto from Psalm 51 is helping. In Psalm 51, we find a despairing prayer. In his distress, which seems to flow out of the depth of his soul, he calls God for mercy. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. The prayer obviously wants to calm God's anger through his prayer. The in Lutheran theology trained Bach, of course, knew about the atoning function of Jesus' death, which is why Pergolesi's Stabat Mater immediately addressed him due to the soteriological cut when it came to appreciating Psalm 51 theologically appropriately. It is striking how fast Pergolesi's Stabat Mater was disseminated after the early death of the Italian composer. As early as 1739, Charles de Brosse described the Stabat Mater as a masterpiece of music. Not even a decade after its creation, Bach at Leipzig held Pergolesi's composition in his hands. The musical as well as the theological setting impressed the Thomas cantor apparently so strongly that he parodied it almost completely and used it for his theological interpretation of Psalm 51. As a Protestant, he subsides the Mariological baseline of the original by taking up the ecclesiological structure and letting the crying mother under the cross of her son become the lamenting community of sinners over their sins. Helpless is the sinner facing God. It remains to him the prayer and the request for forgiveness according to God's abundant mercy. Through rather minor interventions into the musical structure of the musical pattern, Bach causes an independent appropriation of the delivered material with regard to the interpretation of Psalm 51. It is not comprehensible desideratum of theological research of Bach to pay the cantata Tilge höchster meine Sünden an appropriate tribute. This cantata is a theological fireworks and at the same time an important starting point to be able to better understand Bach's parodies. With regard to Tilge höchster meine Sünden, it can be said with nearly certainty that Bach's parodies are theological editorial interventions into their patterns. Bach thought through the emotional theological setting Pergolesi's anew to make the pain of one's sinfulness clearly felt. He is concerned with direct participation of the divine service congregation in the suffering of the psalm prayer, in his powerlessness and his despair. But at the end of the day, also on the deep and embossing experience of the Lord's mercy. With the help of the music of Pergolesi, Bach succeeds as well as the Italian and emotional painting of despair, of grief as fear to draw and transfer to Psalm 51. The Christological point of Bach's cantata lies in networking with Pergolesi's soteriological aim. The washing off one's sin can only be done in connection with the painful death of Christ on his cross. Only Christ is the apprehensive sacrifice that God's wrath can finally satisfy. This is Lutheran Pauline theology at its best. Through emotional participation, it is possible for the believer to grasp the theological meaningfulness of music. Similar to the Baroque opera, the listener is transplanted in an image that puts him in connection with himself. This triggers a reflection process that resembles a theological reflection. The apparent paradox of a powerful feeling in the robe of a silent beauty, which makes up Pergolesi's Stabat Mater, must have deeply impressed Bach. Its parody is a theological brilliant achievement because, with its Christological soteriological core, it focuses the faithful congregation to its midst in Christ, whose grace also reaches the very greatest sinner. It is the path through penance, through the contritio cordis, that is one sinner's mind while listening to the cantata. This powerful theological setting led Bach to fall in love with the Italian, with Pergolesi's way of feeling. My last point, a little conclusion with an outlook. To illuminate the connection between music and emotion more closely in theological terms fills me with great joy every day, because it is worth looking more precisely here. It makes me proud to work on an interpretation of Bach, that he is my daily companion who keeps giving me entirely new perspectives on theology in general. I hope I could let you share a little bit in my joy, that I did not bore you, but could perhaps deliver one or the other basis for discussion about Bach. The interdisciplinary discourse is most survival important for a theological Bach interpretation. To decrypt Bach about an history of emotions way is a new approach that hopefully starts taking place in the world of specialists among the great Bach scholars admired by me, some of whom are active at this wonderful meeting. The small survey through the Pergolesi-Bach connection should give a close insight to my research work. However, for deeper insights in the form of a book, there is still some patience in demand, of which I don't have the very best in this matter. For today, I thank you for your attention and look forward to your suggestions.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for all four speakers. Now the procedures for discussion, probably we will do one by one for the questions and followed by more general themes that come through from the discussion. So the first paper by Alberto, to me it was a very dense and deep paper, and at the same time it was entertaining and enjoyable lecture recital with beautifully rendered performances through which various meanings of musical influence, the coined word in the title, came into my view, the perspective which we all need to give really a deep and careful thoughts when we try to understand Bach's musical language. Alberto, I have got one tiny question to begin with. This is just a clarification. Is that all right with you?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah. You described BWV 579 as transformative. And the next example you use, the final prelude of Book 1 of Words and Clavier, as dismutative. Was it the right word that I captured? Dismutative?
Yeah, dissimulative, as in dissimulation.
Say it again?
Yeah, dissimulative, as in dissimulation.
Dissimulative, right.
Which is a typical 17th century way of social behavior, really.
Yeah.
Never show really who you are in society.
Right. Those seems to be capturing the essential characteristic of what Bach did in the respective pieces. And that was so deep. And I really need to read your carefully crafted paper because it's such a foundational issues that really need to think very carefully whilst listening to. But it was really impressive example of how musician and scholar can arrive at the view, such a summative understanding of the topic. So any questions from the floor, from the participants? So here are the participants.
There was one question from a listener, which I don't know if I'm entitled to answer now. from Maria Beatrice Venanzi. I think it's a question that is best to be answered in person. She writes, it seems the music should always borrow from and imitate other arts in order to be legitimate in some ways. In the 60s, the critic Johannes stated in his Figures 4 that a change of paradigm appeared during Romanticism and later Symbolism, when music became the model for all arts, in particular poetry, with musica poesies. And she asks me, what do you think is Bach's position in relationship to the other arts? Do you think he created music by only following musical models, or as an imitatio Christi, especially in sacred works, or maybe other influence by other arts, literature, painting, can be retraced in his music? If yes, which in particular? And I think, Jo, can I answer the question? Are you okay for me to answer the question now?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I think Maria Beatrice is right, both aesthetically and historiographically, because we know the music has always been dependent aesthetically upon something else, and that that's a cultural paradigm in its own right, which comes from classical antiquity. So there's a cultural explanation to that, but also probably a sociological one, given that musicians, not theorists, but practical musicians, only enjoyed a decent reputation much later than their theoretical counterparts. So it took some time to accept them, and I can mention certainly in the example of Corelli himself, who was admitted very related to the Arcadian Academy in Rome, and this is something that many scholars have made a big fuss about. But really, when eventually was, together with Scarlatti and Pasquini, who happened to be the three most famous musicians in Rome at the time, he still had a specific status very different from the normal men of letters that belong to the aristocracy or the professional classes in Rome. So it took us a while to be accepted and recognized. And so even from a philosophical viewpoint, music, as long as it was linked to the written word or musical or staging, theater, it was or ceremonial or ritual, it was accepted. And other than that, he had to struggle a lot. So we know, I mean, this has been studied, it was Schopenhauer that really revalued music in its own right. And then when the paradigm shift happened in the early 19th century. So I think this is right. My title is obviously provocative in many senses, because there's a Bach scholarship tradition of music and rhetoric, with two camps quite divided between those that believed the Bach was a rhetorician, and those like Peter Williams and Christoph Wolff that don't believe that was the case. And even my own mentor, Lawrence Dreyfus, had something to say against that. So what the point I'm trying to make with the title is that basically my answer is not. Music is music, and especially instrumental music, which tends to look forward and backward at the same time, finding different means, because it tends to evoke rather than represent. It tends to look for its own technical tools, compositional and obviously performative, very importantly as well. Obviously, we lost sense of this, but an ornament can make a huge difference. And so because instrumental music has its own way of progressing or regressing at the same time, then the famous classical ut musica poiesis becomes ut musica musica. So what I'm simply saying, Bach takes Corelli as his model and writes music, nothing else. And then we can make whatever we want of that. But
Well, thanks very much, Alberto. I got a few questions from the audience. Now, it may not be just thrown to you, but for the panel, please consider this question. How important was originality for Bach, in your opinion? Can we go from Alberto, since your paper is on this? How important was originality?
Yeah, I think again this is a much later aesthetic category, which is not necessarily important to an early modern musician or to an early modern artist. I always mention in a more sort of in lighter sessions, I always mention that the many Madonnas that were painted by painters all across the 17th and 18th centuries. You repeat the same subject all over again. It's like doing your fugue or on the 6-note hexachord. That's really not the point. Is not the 6-note hexachord or the Madonna itself, but how you deal with it, how you treat that. So in that sense, originality, in the sense in which we post-Beethovenian understand it, I suppose was totally relevant to Bach. Now, to be honest, to Vivaldi and Corelli and Albinoni and all that, we also must say that Bach had no particular constraints when he was writing instrumental music, concertos and sonatas. So as Sara has explained and Thomas, he could pick and choose whatever he wanted because simply it was not in the market. And being not in the market, it's a great advantage in the sense that you don't have to publish, you don't have to please your patron, you don't have to please your audience. So, there's all what we call social, cultural, and economic constraints are not there simply for Bach. And so, from our perspective, post-Beethovenian of originality, now we found this amazing. Now, the question may be, and you know how much I love Bach, and I hope my paper showed that I love Bach with all my heart. But maybe we can turn around the question and see whether he would have sold a copy in Venice or in Rome of any he wrote at the time. Because as much as we consider it great music, it rarely meets the taste of people that at the time bought music or consumed music on a weekly basis.
Well, thanks very much. Anyone else would like to answer this question? How important was originality for Bach?
Well, I think we kind of answered already in the conclusion of our lecture recital when we said that it wasn't simply taking all those, let's call them information, we would call it in our time now, and put it together just to form something that resembled something else. He had his way of treating music and of writing music, as Alberto was saying before, and yeah, he took all that information and he made music. So in some way he was original, but I don't think this was his aim. It was just a way of working, of doing music.
Yes, he combined all the interesting ideas and used his common sense as a German musician, created a mixed style or his own Bachian style, doesn't it? And that sounded like original and sounded like Bach. Yeah, well, there's another interesting question from the floor, which is about imitatio. In your opinion, the musicians Bach imitated were chosen by him due to their Italianness or only for their musical qualities? That's quite relevant to this topic of the conference. Is it Italian characters or just for the qualities? Anyone?
Well, I can start. I can answer the first part of the question just by saying that. Then I leave it to my colleagues the second part about the musical qualities. Just by saying that the notion of Italian style is in itself an anachronism. So we know it. If I ask all the Italians in the room where they're from, they'll tell you, I'm from Rome, I'm from Naples. So the pluralism is the regionalization. In fact, I mean, it's cultural and it's very deep, and especially in a not unified Italy, which attempted to unify itself culturally through the model of literature and the great Dante Petrarch Boccaccio troika of Italian literature, but still adopting one specific literary language, that of Tuscany of the time. So when we say when we see this from a foreign perspective, it's very easy to mistake Rome for Venice and Turin for Naples, and so on and so forth, and call that Italian, because it's easy to say Italian. After all, now we're all Italians. And this is precisely what happened in the 18th century. So the idea of the mixed taste stemmed from a profound misunderstanding of what was available at the time. Whereas you can think of French music, because after all, French music happened mostly in Paris and mostly at the court, in court. You can't say the same about the wealth of repertoire stemming from Italian cities. So what I think Bach liked is some compositional principles and some performative one as well, when he worked on ornamentation, for example, as Tommaso has demonstrated. But in terms of composition, what he liked a lot was, for example, the ritornello principle used by the Venetian composers. He liked very much the chain of suspensions in the Roman trio sonata, Corelli and friends. So it's these sort of things that appeal to his intellect. And I think he had a very vague notion of what Italy was like at the time. Rome was like, I always compare it to the New York of the 1980s. I mean, it's a place where, and when I took my university students on a tour, I placed them in the center of Palazzo Doria Pamphili in Rome, and they're amazed by the splendor. This is something that was quite unique at the time. So it's too easy, I think, to. That's why in English we use the word Italianate, which is much more appropriate, I think, to describe some foreign practices with Italian composition and performance elements, rather than call them simply Italian.
So, my Italian colleagues, on musical qualities in those music that Bach took, rather than Italianateness. It may be difficult, but another question, if you would like to think of it, there was a question related to Mozart's Italian style. Do you think it makes sense to compare Bach's Italian style with Mozart? Is there any interesting facts maybe learned from such a study?
I think one of the biggest difference that one has to take into account is that Mozart knew Italy as a country, well, not unified country, but anyway, he knew the place. He was in contact personally with Italian musicians, and Bach was just in touch with the manuscripts that he happened to get to know. So I think that is one of the biggest differences that we can take into account studying this question.
Yeah, and also perhaps chronological differences may have had a different perspective of what Italian styles was. The styles moved on from Bach's time, I suppose.
Yes. Also because we studied, for example, the sonata in E major as a modern sonata, kind of far away from Bach's usual style and way of composing. So time passing by, things probably have changed also in a way of understanding what Italian style was, and also in the theater language, also in the musical theater language, it changed a lot. So I think it's difficult to compare the two things, because many things change in the passing of time.
Yeah, genre itself changed, didn't it? The Sonata da Camera, Chiesa, those two that you mentioned, they disappeared at the time of Mozart, basically, transformed into something else. So, yeah, it's a difficult question. So now, how are we doing with time? Can we move on to the next paper? Any specific questions for your paper? I thought your paper was a very interesting one. Through closer look at the works by Bach and Vivaldi, the focus was BWV 1035, which is placed carefully in a broader chronological and stylistic context. And the name that I wasn't aware, Blochwitz. Yeah, who was he or she? I couldn't catch quite well. Sorry.
Yes, he was first oboist in the Dresdner Orchestra, and then in 1717 he started to work also as a flutist there.
I see. So he knew also Kubantz that later joined in the band.
I don't remember actually when he stopped working there, because I remember a stopping.
Right. Okay.
For us, it was important to focus on Buffardin and Blochwitz, that were the flutists of that orchestra, because they received the manuscripts, in particular RV 84. So in some way, Vivaldi addressed those works to these flutists.
Yeah.
And we know Bach knew Buffardin, so we don't know exactly if he met also Blochwitz, but they worked in the same action zones, so to say.
Yeah. Now this is one of the sonatas I remember myself examining in the context of his Bach's influence from Dresden around the time that you discussed. Marshall was the scholar who suggested that this sonata may be related to Berlin, 1741, at his visit there. And now, interestingly, Johann Kubantz wrote a piece which shares the opening motive. You know, the first tune goes up and going down, and when it falls down, he uses the French ornament called coulé, which is a fitting in the arpeggio with the passing notes. And that is a particular melodic gesture that Bach used in his composition in 1740-41. It appears at the beginning of Gobe Variation aria. It appears in this flute sonata, and it also appears in the Weltenberg-Clavier Book 2 B major prelude around the middle. And that is the only three places that I know that these ornaments were used by Bach. And it's all around that date, 1740-41. And in the past, I thought that this was related to Dresden because Kubantz, the composition which seems to have been the model for this flute sonata, which was not my view. It was research done by Mary Oleskiewicz in the United States in her paper of 1999, I thought. So she hinted that Kubantz was somehow inspiration to Bach around that time. But Kubantz was traveling between Dresden and Berlin around that time and finally settles in Berlin 1741. So it is either way. What interests me is that there's a possibility of link between Dresden and Berlin for the musical styles, how the performers themselves being in exchange with manuscripts, music, together with the fact that many virtuosos are from France and Italy in those days, and then examples like that, not just in Berlin and Dresden, but other places too. So it is a question that we could also look at a link to Dresden and not just limited to Berlin. That was my sort of line that I would perhaps take. How would you think about that?
Well, there's certainly a connection with Dresden. In fact, also the sonata RV51 that is the one that RV50 that is the one that was thought to be by Vivaldi, and now it's probably be related to the same Blochwitz we were talking about before, is conserved in the Dresdner library. So I think there's surely a connection and a kind of triangle between Bach, the works by Vivaldi, and this time lapse we are talking about. I didn't know about that work about once, so I'll make sure that we'll check it in the next days.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions from other presentators?
Can I just ask a quick question to Sara and Giovanni? How idiomatic do you think will be the flute writing and in Vivaldi and Bach? I've always thought, I mean, despite the fact that people say that Bach's violin writing is fantastic, I think it's very awkward. You have to practice many hours to be able to make sense of it. At the end, it makes sense because it's logical, but it's not. Doesn't really fall under your fingers the way it should. And I wonder whether Vivaldi, how Vivaldi writes for the flute, whether it's any better.
Yes, no, that is a difficult question because there was one point that caused some problems at the beginning of our research, because when we had decided we wanted to work with Vivaldi's works, then we found out lately all the 4 sonatas for transverse flute are probably not by Vivaldi. So accepting that, for the reasons we said before, we decided to work anyway on those works because they were significant anyway. But it's difficult to say if that writing is by Vivaldi. And let's say that it's in those sonatas, the language is sometimes very flutistic, very idiomatic for the flute, because it's written probably by flutists themselves that wanted to sell their works as Vivaldi's works because it was fashionable. So the parts that are written by flutists or people that knew a lot about the flute are really, that go, as you said before, they go easily under the fingers, are easy to play, and are really, how can I say, are really right for the instrument. There are other parts that are taken from violin sonatas, like for example, the jig we played before. It's taken, if I remember right, from RV27, Sonata for Violin, and it got an adaptation. I don't remember, it's written a little bit lower or higher in order to be better playable on the flute, but it's not really a flute piece, and you can notice that while practicing it. And there are strange jumps sometimes, and so. We played also the Concerto da Camera RV84 just to have a look and to see how the language, how really Vivaldi's language for the flute was. And I have to say that language, as we can find in, for example, the piccolo concertos or so, are more easily playable on the flute. Bach has the big difference from the obbligato sonatas, let's say the 30, 32, to the 34, 35, that is a big difference. And in the 35, you can really notice how the care for what is playable, above all as length of the sentences on the flute, is much more under the focus than in the first ones. In the B minor sonata, for example, sentences are really too long to be played on the flute. On the modern flute, I can't say on the traverso, because the hole in the embouchure and everything is really different. So I don't play the traverso, so I can't say. But for what I read, the difficulty of the length of the sentences was already an issue at that time.
Well, very good. Thank you very much, Sara. I have a general question from the general public. I know this person. This question itself, I will read. Is there something specifically Italianate about vocal melismas that find their way into Italian instrumental works, Corelli and so on? Anyone would like to offer answer?
I don't understand the question whether she or he means specifically Italian or specifically Italian. In a sense, there's nothing specifically Italian in making long melismas. It's just a cultural construct. That, you know, it happens to be the case that the Italian words tend to have an accent on the penultimate syllable. And that's a good place to lean, a good place to make a long ornament. So the language is specifically suited to long melismas just before closing the phrase. No, when you stop on a dominant harmony just before resolving on the tonic. Now, obviously, like everything else, including the spaghetti bolognese, it's all culturally determining. You know, people like us, they do it in different places, and then become identified as typically Italian. But I wouldn't be so deterministic about the fact that we Italian have to be the lyrical, the melodic. I think every people need. You know, I just, I'm in fact, if I can say so, I'm a bit fed up with this cultural nationalism that posits quality. I mean, this is the language of the 18th century writers who had an agenda. No, when they said, "Oh, the French are very elegant, the Italian are very vigorous, and the German can put everything together and make it better." This is clearly a political and cultural agenda that should not have any currency in serious musical discourse anymore.
Yeah.
I think we got it. We understand why these people did it. But I don't think, even when we read in booklet, we play in an Italian way. I really don't know what that means, except for the fact that being Italian, I play like an Italian probably. But I wouldn't essentialize, as we say, those characteristics as being specifically Italian or French or Spanish. Otherwise, we really, I don't think we go anywhere.
Well, that is in our work level, of course, but for teaching at the undergrad level, we need to be brutally stereotypically describing those. Otherwise, they don't learn it. So that's the starting point of learning and going into the deeper level where you find all the nuance and complexities in action. And so let's
sorry, and I agree with you, Jot, on this. I think at an first year undergraduate, we may teach like that.
Yeah.
Also because our undergraduate, don't read anymore, don't listen to music anymore. So because they access learning through the internet, they'll find the same thing. They just go on Wikipedia and find exactly the same nonsense. So we better probably tell them ourselves and then type it. So, but I do agree.
Yeah, okay. So may I turn to the third speaker, Tommaso? Is he round? No? Oh, yeah, he's coming on. Very good. I thought his paper was very interesting, and particularly I wanted my students to watch. That was very easy to understand what Bach did in BWV 974, which gives us a fantastic opportunity to understand him as a performer and composer, his characteristic attitude to demonstrate what a Baroque performer should do. I appreciated very much the thorough explanation of background of how Bach's keyboard transcription of Italian concertos took form. There was a talk, article, I can't remember who that was, but when the Prince Johannes studied in Netherlands, there was a custom in Amsterdam or nearby Amsterdam where something happening there, where the particular style of organ performance was in vogue, namely the transcription of Italian concertos, and that was probably triggered how that culture took its form, took it in Prince's homeland of Weimar. But well, so that is a kind of thing that wasn't there. So I wanted to supplement a little bit. Yeah, all its ingenuity of Bach's attitude, his characteristic attitude to musical performance was brought to light. And so I enjoyed very much and stimulated by the presentation. Now, comments, questions from Amsterdam or nearby Amsterdam? I'm hearing something of what I said about 20 seconds ago. Yeah, something happening technically. Right, okay. Tommaso cannot hear according to the technical. So, okay, what can we do? We can't get him online. So, can we move on to Stefan's very unique but important contribution to the dialogue? There were comments from the audience appreciating the diversity, interdisciplinary aspects of research is essential for us to have a complete holistic understanding of Bach's works. He was a church musician, huge contribution, time dedicated for the glory of God. And at the same time, you examined Pelgressi's contribution to unpack our engagement with Bach, how he parodied the work. Now, texted music like this gives us clear opportunity to engage unambiguous evidence that will unfold when we engage with it. And one of the most important evidence of this outcome is what we see in B minor Mass. Et incarnatus est. The harmonic language of Pelgressi's is clearly visible to me. And that's sort of stylistic diversity that Bach opened up, continuing even towards the end of his life, trying to absorb what is new and essentially good, he captured and practiced in his works. So I got the questions from floors. Now, may I read it? Do you think, Stefan, is it all right? Do you think Bach's sacred music is Christian or Lutheran? Or in other terms, does confessional identity means a lot when interpreting his sacred works?
Oh, that's a good one to start up, I think. That's the core of the problem, I think. If you see it with the aesthetics of Hegel, you could say music, as such as music is not being captured by confessional identities and something like that, if you hear it. But if you look at the intentions of composing music in the Baroque area, like Bach's, take for example his church cantatas at this point, you will see that you have confessional colorization in order to catechetical, what's the English word? You know, to teach religion contents to other people. You could see it at the Church of St. Thomas every year. There are many young people, boys and girls, around the altar, and they have to confirm their faith in front of the cross of God and something like that. And in the Baroque area, you have to teach about music what you have to believe, I think. So if you look at Bach, at his education, at his confessional education, and growing up with Lutheran theology in Eisenach and Ohrdruf and Lüneburg and something like that, you can see that all of his works are intentionalized in a confessional way, I think. But what's the problem with interpretation in the 21st century? I think a Catholic interpreter, musicologist or theologian or both, like Meinrad Walter, if you know him, there are no problems with confessional backgrounds. I don't think a Catholic interpreter would see in Bach's Passion music, for example, another thing than a Protestant one. But I think music in his in the intentionalization of composing in 18th century is an interpretation problem. Yes, it's a big question.
Another question to you: in your opinion, through its universal formulas, that dialogue between Italian Catholic culture and German Lutheran one, that of Bach, was possible?
Yeah, I asked back what meant universal formulas. I'm not quite sure if it music formulas or theological formulas like sentences and teachings and something like that. But to answer it at a wider way, we could say, I think, both confessional cultures knew each other very well, but they knew each other in a controversial way. You see in Bach's library, like Robin Lever pointed out at the end of the 1980s, you can see apologetical Protestant works against Catholic theology, but also against Calvinistic theology from the Lutheran point of view. So inner struggles with Protestants, you know, Protestants are very differentiated families, if you want. That was so in 18th century until today. But I'm not quite sure what universal formulas meant. If it's about teachings, I would say you have universal formulas from the Catholic sides, as you Marian piety and something like that. You have the Eucharist, center of the divine service. You have the sacraments, and you have something like that. And at Bach's side, you have another point of view at the core of Lutheran theology between law and gospel. I said it in my lecture recital, and you could follow this line through the sacred works. They knew each other well. I want to do the conclusion at this point and hope I could answer the question. They knew each other well, and it's a very exciting point in interpreting Bach today in a Catholic and Protestant way, I think.
Yeah, there was a clarification from the listener. Universal formula as elements which are higher than cultural difference. Does it help to reformulate your answer?
Yeah, I'm just searching for the written word here. I can read. Okay, I hope I could answer the question already. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you did.
Yeah.
Now, somebody have posted. Can I read that one? Bach is in history of transcription practice, so to say, at the very starting point. In general, with the exception of some works that can be assimilated to parody practice, such as the work that you have discussed today, his transcriptions are mostly re-instrumentation of practical necessity, just as it is the case for Mozart, Handel re-instrumentation of some decades later.
Yeah, I answer. I see it as another question, but I answer this one first. It's the biggest problem you can see in case of parody and interpreting parody works of Bach. You have, on the one hand side, you have a practicability of musical production and serious lines, like the cantata productions in the 1720s. It's a big work, you know, one after the other. And so you have to look, what do you have in your worksheet if you want as a composer? But on the other hand, that's my point, and I want to point it out at my book I'm writing on. There is a theological one, because it's no, sorry, I'm searching the word. English, it's very, it's no coincidence, that's the word. It's no coincidence that you take the first sentence, the first movement of the Weihnachtsoratorium, for example, Jauchzet, frohlocket, and you look at the cascades of tones and something like that, and bring it together with the text under the music. So he searched his parody templates, if you want, in a theological matter. That's my hypothesis. And I hope I can discuss it and defend it in the next years. And Tilger Höchster, Meine Sünden, BWV 1083, is a very great example for this opinion, I think.
So there are a few more questions coming.
Sorry, can I just chip in on one thing about the transcriptions?
Yeah,
I think we because we geeky students and love all the minutiae of musicological work. I think we put too much emphasis probably on some practices, including those by Bach, which were just routine practices. Now, when you get bored, what do? Well, let me transcribe a concerto. I mean, I wonder whether we would do the same with opera. You know, if we take piano reduction of operas and we start making a big deal about the fact that the passage was a shadow scene and with trombones, and now it's just in the lower register of the piano. What I'm saying is that there's two levels of analysis. We can go into great details and show differences and similarities, but certainly without losing sight of the fact that what you may gain in transcription, you also lose in translation a lot. Because unlike parodies, we can change the text and give new meaning to the music through literary text. In instrumental music, it's not quite the same, really, to replace an oboe or a violin with the upper register of the harpsichord. And I'm afraid I think there's a, still this aura of genius and geniality in some, I suppose, routine work that any student of Bach could have done just as well. In fact, we're not even sure he did himself, probably. We entrusted the students with. So a bit of perspective on, the cult of personality, the Instagram and Facebook kind of atmosphere, which I think did not belong to Bach really seriously, in the sense. So there's some serious creative work and some less successful work. I mean, for example, flute, violin, and keyboard concerto. It's not a great work. I mean, just fails to do what the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto does so well. So, like any human being, Bach himself was subject to success and failure. Sometimes in maybe not in equal measure, but at least 20% of times.
Right. Another burning question to Stefan. You credit Descartes with bringing attention to emotions, but then you turn to Pergolesi's influence. These are two different strands, right? What would you say is more influential?
First of all, it's an honor to answer a question from Joyce Irwin. I admire your book. Yeah, I admire the book about the Lutheran musical theology in the 17th century. And now I'm a bit nervous too, but I will do my best. I think with Descartes' back noise, my hypothesis was Descartes' back noise, theoretical back noise of emotional theories and teaching of affects in the 17th and 18th century. There you have the theoretical side of the same thing, I think. Because on the other hand side, there are composers which are made Cartesianism heard, if they want or not, with their compositions to set in mind the theoretical ideas of Descartes in a practical way. So we have two ways to Bach's Tilge höchster meine Sünden. One about the theoretical background, which was given to Bach and other composers in Germany by Johann Matthison's theoretical writings. Johann Matthison fell in love with Descartes' attracted passions of the soul and worked on it in many works, I think. And on the other hand side, you have the practical tone painting, if you want so, of this theoretical background in Pergolesi's and Bach's music, and Telemann's music, for example, too. And so we have a receptional level, which is another one than in a theoretical background. I hope this answers the question. Joyce Irwin, and greetings to you.
Right. Okay. Now there's another question from unnamed source. Schweitzer, in his book, declares to regret the fact that Bach began composing cantatas with the aria da capo in the Italian style, abandoning the idea of composing cantatas nello stile antico with recitative ariosi instead of catchy arias like BWV 106 Actus Tragicus. What do you think? Anyone?
Why not? I mean, I suppose. Why not? No,
right. Okay.
Why should Bach have looked back? It's, unless there was a specific purpose. Monteverdi did it only because he was applying for the position of choir master at St. Mark's. So otherwise he kept on writing quite luxurious and lascivious at times madrigal. Yeah. But so I think. I mean, it's a bit. I mean, we all due respect to Schweitzer, and it's an old school way of thinking about Bach as a serious composer all the time. And I think again, it lacks a bit of humanity then, and the sense of humor, that's the wit that the Bach has, like every great artist, in so good measure. So fashion is fashion, and you write in the 1730s, you write da capo aria. Full stop. Scarlatti did the same. Start writing da capo arias, never stopped. That's what it is. I'm afraid. I mean, all these meta narratives don't leave a room for nuances. Then.
Yeah. Well, at this point, I think I will read out from our friend Tommaso, who was called by technical glitch. From him, there's some text coming. May I read it? So works like cantatas and concertos are being transcribed for other instruments, often the case when the original ones weren't available. The concerto transcriptions for solo harpsichord and organs are quite an exception, since they do not respond to the necessity of public occasions. And in another post, paradoxically, their functions is, in my view, comparable to that of many 19th century transcriptions, the transmission of a musical content to an amateur for his own enjoyment. That's what I have from him. That's not in a right chronological order of reading out, but he's also present amongst us. So now I think this is basically collected all the comments from the public as well as from my friends online. Now, are there any burning issues that you'd like to ask each other at this point? Remaining questions.
I have one for Alberto, if it's okay. I want to ask.
I had one for Stefan, so go ahead.
So, which is the hardest? That would be the first, I think.
No, mine is very simple. I'm totally ignorant on the point, so I need a straight answer.
Okay, I wanted to ask to precise the difference between imitatio and a parody. What do you say? I use the word parody for Tilge Höchster meine Sünden, like I use the word spaghetti for good food, but what's
the universal?
Yeah. What do you think?
I think obviously my work is not so original. There's lots of studies on 16th century music by our Mayer Brown and all tradition of students of rhetorics that study all this stuff. The interesting thing maybe is that it's not been applied to later repertoire because we tend to go with Renaissance, Baroque, and categories and classify things rather than looking at cultural processes across centuries. So in my definition, so imitatio is the Latin term. And then within imitatio, you can have degrees of imitation, including parody. So when you transcribe, in a sense, even the Albanian transcription is an example of imitatio by rhetorical standards. Parody becomes a bit complex, and if we use applying to late 17th century, early 18th century music, we can do it, being aware that there's a fierce debate among 16th century specialists of whether they should use the term parody mass at all or not. So maybe trying to frame that debate first, and then we can start using it ourselves. But definitely it's a shade of the same. It's a variety of the same cultural behavior, and I think it's a cultural behavior of doing things in the manner of alla maniera italiana, like the aria variata. If that answers your question, I can ask my question to you. Do you think? And I swear I don't know this, so it's not at all provocative. I just you think the dialogue was relevant? It's certainly relevant to us. The interconfessional dialogue. It is because of Pope Benedict, Pope Francis. it is. No, we going more and more ecumenical as we go on, and I think that's a great thing in itself. But historically, say in the Leipzig or Dresden of the 1730s, would have been relevant to them, the interconfessional dialogue? I mean, do you think there was a serious attempt at reconciling different Christian dogmas from different confessions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just want to start with an with an experience from my youth, if it's allowed. Our musician at the Cathedral of Limburg, where I was in the boys' choir, always said, when I wish to perform Bach's Passions on the Holy Friday, he always said, "Not too much Bach; it's too Protestant." That's for the 1990s. Yeah. But back to the 1800s. No, I think in Leipzig it's not a big case, the dialogue between Catholic theology and Protestant theology, but between Protestant theologies on themselves, between Lutheran theology, for example, and the Calvin theology. Yeah, that's a big point. And if Joyce Irwin is still here, she could tell you more about that, because she did her research in that field. And of course, when you look at Bach's works, you have to interpret the background of theological education, which was Lutheran, reading Leonhard Hutter's Compendium Theologicum, which was a Lutheran handbook of faith and dogmatic points. But still, Bach and other knew about Catholic sentences and teachings, I think, out of these books in a controversial way, not in a pure and ecumenical way, I think.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Any further points? So I think our 3 hours and a little bit, this marathon session seems to be to end. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your input and expertise for this conference. And I thoroughly enjoyed and learned a great deal from each of you. And I hope your research will be successful and bear fruits. I know that many of you engaged in your own fields and already making a mark. But from this friendship that we are bonded, I hope we will have a further exchange in the future, possible collaboration or exchanges that results from here, not just Italy, but globally. Yeah, is that all right, everyone? Right. So thank you again, and to the online audience as well. Thank you for tuning in to Bach in Italian style session. So, grazie, and how to say goodbye in Italian? Anyone?
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Okay.